This is HighIntensityBusiness.com with Lawrence Neal, helping you achieve your health and fitness goals. Become a great personal trainer and build your high-intensity strength training business.
Lawrence Neal here, and welcome back to HighIntensityBusiness.com. Today's guest is Dr. Bryce Lee. Bryce is a former surface warfare naval officer turned director of therapy and co-founder of StrengthSpace, a provider of resistance-based exercise and physical therapy services. Bryce, welcome to the show.
Hey, Lawrence. It's a privilege to be back.
Yeah, no, it's good to have you back. And it's been a while since we spoke over Skype like this. So really excited to dig into today's topic. And so we were, there was a number of things we could talk about. I mean, you have this kind of rare position where I don't know many people like you. And that's someone who is very well versed in physical therapy and also now, strength training and high intensity training. And so there's so much we could talk about. But one of the things you mentioned is this idea or this thing called muscle activation, which is a really interesting concept to me because it's something I've been thinking about over the last few years. I hear that and I think, is that necessary? What does that mean? What's actually happening here? And I'm just, my intellectual curiosity kind of peaks around that. And so in preparation for this, I was doing what everyone does, which is I went on YouTube and I searched muscle activation, and a whole load of very interesting videos popped up. But I got to admit, as I was sort of going through them, my bullshit meter was, spiking, and a lot of it just didn't really pass the sniff test for me. So I'm sure it's not all crap. This is the thing. I'm sure it's quite complex, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so excited to be able to go through it with you. So just to I guess set the scene, and I think it would be important throughout this to define the words that we're using. So do you want to just start off by explaining, what exactly does muscle activation mean in your mind?
Yeah. So in the modern sports magazines, running magazines, and even in the parlance of certain practitioners who sort of specialize in addressing this issue, muscle activation is this idea that some of our muscles are reluctant to be recruited. They don't want to turn on and be recruited when we need them to. And so we need to address underlying problems in order to help that happen. We need to do specific drills and activation exercises in order to help a given muscle turn on when we need it to. And so, other terms that you'll hear that describe this problem are things like my muscle isn't firing, my trainer, my physical therapist told me that my glute isn't firing, or that I have gluteal amnesia. These are all words that are kind of used to describe this issue. And so, the question is there any science behind the issue at all, right? That's first. Is there any chance that the science is sort of being confounded by an element of bro science on top of it, right? And then what do we, trainers, what do we actually need to do about this if there is any truth to it? I think that's kind of how I was thinking about it. What I don't want to do is sort of besmirch any person out there who puts a lot of emphasis on this in their own work with clients or patients. And so maybe trying to figure out a way to identify what's true about this would be helpful to start. So I think when we think about how your brain recruits muscles, right, you have motor neurons in your brain that are associated with individual motor units in your muscle. You don't have a nerve or a neuron in your brain that says contract the biceps, right? Because there's actually a lot of motor units in your biceps. What you have a bunch of motor neurons in your brain that move down from your brain through your spinal cord. They synapse with nerves in your spinal cord that then go out. Those are lower motor neurons, and then they fire that muscle. There are situations where you could have a muscle fiber that won't recruit. It's really hard to recruit. And probably the best, most well-studied example of this is something called arthrogenic inhibition. It's a big word, arthro, joint, right? So it's coming from the joint and it's an inhibition, right? So the best example of this is an ACL rupture, your anterior cruciate ligament in your knee. When it ruptures, okay, It's inside your knee. There's a ton of swelling, and that swelling fills up the space within the joint. Okay. And so that's what we're talking about. And you can actually simulate this by simply injecting saline into somebody's knee and replicating that swelling. And what you get very quickly is an almost inability to deliberately straighten the knee out. The quadricep just almost turns off. Okay. So that's a real thing, right? And that sort of informs this discussion, is understanding there's this real phenomenon where a person has an ACL repair, there's a lot of swelling or an ACL injury, and they really have a struggle to even use their quadriceps at all.
How does the quadricep turn off? I thought it would be innervated from the, if that's the right word, from the spinal column. So I thought if it was above the knee, the quad at the hip, that would cause the quad to turn off, not below.
Yeah. So there's multiple things that drive a muscle contraction, right? Part of it is, well, it's quite complex. So the default position for a muscle, believe it or not, is actually on. In other words, it's actually contracted. And a lot of the input that's coming from your brain down to the muscle is actually sort of a holding back or a restraining impulse telling that muscle to chill out and relax. So a person has a stroke, for example, and that top-down inhibition, which is supposed to be there for all of us all the time, that actually gets diminished. And now that person has overactive reflexes. You tap the tendon on their knee and their leg jumps out really hard and then bounces a couple of times. So part of it is actually that the default position for any given muscle or any given motor neuron is to be firing, and it's being constantly inhibited all the time. That's kind of a really hard thing to wrap your head around. And then part of that inhibition is also coming up from nerves that are in the joints and in the opposing muscles, right? So for example, it wouldn't make sense to have your hamstrings fighting your quads if you were trying to stand up. And so when your quads go to contract, they'll send a signal up, which will then synapse with your hamstrings and inhibit the hamstrings from firing at the same time. Not that they could never fire at the same time to co-contract or to stabilize, but there's a lot of information coming from the brain down and from the joint up to where these things meet in the spinal cord. And so you're right. If there wasn't that information coming up, it wouldn't make sense. But the fact that we have nerves coming from the joint itself that are sort of sensing what's going on in the joint, informing that relationship. So a bunch of these nerves are meeting each other in the spinal cord, and a final sort of decision. It's probably more algorithmic rather than somebody making a decision, right? But that's a bunch of switches are flipped in just the right order, which says yes or no, this muscle can fire. So that's why you can have this situation where nerve impulse comes up from the joint to the spinal cord and really gives a powerful inhibitory effect on a motor neuron, and the quad doesn't fire. So all that is to say that there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of complexity in how muscles fire, and there is a real way in which a muscle could be inhibited. That's a thing, right? So then the question is, well, just because that's real, does that mean that we need to be activating muscles, right? Because it turns out that you can try to activate that quad all day, but if you don't get the swelling in the joint right, you're not gonna get the motion. So it's sort of what comes first? Does inhibition lead to a lack of function, or is some sort of impairment leading to the inhibition? And I think that's where people kind of get a little confused about this. There's a study. I was just looking for it because I was just reading it the other day, but I was looking for it before we turned on. And it talks about runners and athletes at the beginning of a season who are healthy and have strong glutes. And some of those runners develop knee pain during the season. And then it's found that they have weak glutes. But the weak glutes couldn't have been the cause because they were strong at the beginning of the season. But it's easy to make that mistake if you just sample runners and you say, well, let's see. The ones with strong glutes feel good. The ones with weak glutes, or whose glutes aren't firing or are somewhat inhibited, they have knee pain. Therefore, inhibited glutes cause knee pain. That's a very obvious assumption to make, but it's wrong. And at least this research suggests that it's backwards, and that any inhibition might be a result of rather than a driver of dysfunction. So that's part of it, right? That's part of the problem, is that we look at early studies that are associational. And just like anything else, where you see an association between, yoga and heart disease, and people who do yoga have less heart disease. Well, yeah, but they also, eat healthier and they don't smoke and whatever, right? And so you don't know where the causal relationship and direction of causality is. This is a case where what we might be assuming is driven by weak or inhibited glutes is actually that weakness and inhibition is a result of dysfunction.
It's a cause-effect reversal, basically.
You got it. Yeah. And so to kind of give a little more history, a lot of this stuff, this idea of inhibited muscles sort of originated. Maybe we could point to a guy named Vladimir Janda, Janda, who was I forget the country. He's a European physiotherapist, and he came up with these ideas that certain muscles will, in a predictable way, will become short and tight, and other muscles will become long and weak. Okay. And so an example would be your hip flexors get short and tight because you sit all day, and then that leads to elongated weak glutes. And so until you get the reflex, get that tightness in the hip flexor to go away, you can never get your glutes to turn on. So you have to stretch your hip flexors to get your hips to turn on. And that's a common idea. Again, I think it's one that isn't really borne out by studies, by research. It's a just so story, like so much of this stuff, right? Where it looks so
like
simple,
an axiom
it makes perfect sense.
People
exactly.
accept. Yeah,
it's a truism, right?
Yeah.
And so, in this case, you sort of tell that the idea, the underlying premise. One of the ways you could falsify it is by testing one of its conclusions. One of its conclusions would be you should never strengthen the hip flexors because they're already so tight. You should only stretch them. And I see the opposite work, and other people see the opposite work, that directly strengthening the hip flexors actually helps them to be more relaxed, right? Because maybe one of the reasons that they're so tight is because they're weak in the first place. And they're sort of white knuckling everything, kind of like the way a little old lady would hold on to the leash of a big dog, right? That she wouldn't be able to relax. She would always be very tightly gripping everything. So Yanda's upper and lower cross syndromes, very popular. No real literature to show they are even real, but they're very popular because they're elegant ideas. They feed into all of our desires for this sort of secret. We want the secret to pain. We want the secret sauce. And they definitely scratch that itch that we all have for secret sauce. And so once you figure out there's an upper lower cross syndrome, aha, I have the secret. This is why your neck hurts. This is why your back hurts. Let's just stretch you out this way and strengthen you this way, and it'll all be better. And it just doesn't work out as elegantly as that. Your body's much messier than that, much more complicated. So you can see that a lot of this, when you look at Runner's World and magazines where they mention gluteal amnesia, a lot of what's happening is they're really just regurgitating these older ideas. Something on one side of the joint is tight, something on the other side is inhibited. It's an elegant idea, like I said. I don't know if it really holds up to scientific rigor. And that doesn't mean that getting somebody moving, stretching, exercising isn't going to help them. The question is, why is it helping them, right? What is actually helping them? Is it the fact that they're moving more and getting stronger, and that they're actually just getting some muscle mass back into their glutes, which had atrophied from disuse, or is it something special? Like, for example, we've woken the muscle back up; it was asleep. I struggle with this topic because consistently, I'll notice that I put somebody on my gluteator, my beloved Dynavet gluteator, and their third rep is better than their first rep, right? And so it's like, oh my gosh, were their glutes asleep? Well, first of all, if they were, it's obviously pretty easy to fix it. You just get them using it, and all of a sudden they're awake, and I don't have to do anything special beforehand to deal with it. We just got them going. I think another part of it might be that rather than their glutes being asleep, it's more a matter of it's easy to recruit hard muscles that we recruit hard regularly. So maybe that sounds like it's the same thing, but I think it's more a matter of what a person feels threatened by. So if you take a person and they have never exercised or haven't been exercising, and you put them on a leg press, you could say, oh, well, they're very weak. They're weaker than they look. Maybe their muscles are asleep, but it could also be that their body just doesn't feel safe taking the break off and really letting them work hard. And so a lot of what happens in the first 4 to 8 weeks of high intensity training or any kind of training is the person learns to work and to allow their body and to trust their body to work in a way that they weren't able to do before. They allow themselves to not be, whether they would verbalize it this way or not, they suddenly feel comfortable letting go of the brakes and really pushing hard in a way that before would have felt super maximal and dangerous. And I think that you sort of see this especially with an exercise like the gluteator. The chest press is another one where somebody's first rep feels harder than their third rep a lot of the times. Something else that happens is we have this whole kind of idea about activation thresholds. How big of a signal does your brain need to send down to a muscle to get it to recruit motor units, right? That's very much, sort of a volume thing. You can imagine you start your set of leg press, you're only recruiting some of your motor units. And then as those fatigue, your brain has to kind of crank the volume up on the signal to get other things to recruit, right? And the louder and louder you get, the more recruitment you get. As fatigue builds, though, it's kind of counterintuitive. The more fatigued a muscle is locally, the easier it is to recruit all of it, right? Because it's so weak at that point that it takes less to recruit it. And so that's another reason why maybe what we're doing with all of these activation exercises is we're just getting a little fatigue in, and now it's easier to recruit. It's not because anything was sleep. It's just because you've lowered the activation threshold, which you would expect with any exercise, right? So it's like, does it have to be a special magic glute exercise, or will any exercise that affects your glutes actually get better recruitment, better stimulus? And so you see that. You'll see somebody do a study where they'll say, hey, look, we did this research. We had people do a glute warm-up, and we noticed decreased activation thresholds. Therefore, glute warm-ups work. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, sure, they work at lowering the recruitment threshold, but so would anything else. They haven't actually controlled for what type of exercise they were doing. And then you can look at other exercise other studies. And I have a good one you can throw in the show notes if you like, that actually looks at, hey, do people actually perform better, get stronger when they do a glute warm up versus a regular warm up of their task? Do you need to do frog, glute bridges and whatever other fashionable thing, or is just jumping and warming up for jumping using jumps, are both of those things going to give you pretty much the same result? And I think the answer is yes, that you don't have to get over complex with how you warm up the glutes to drive.
It kind of comes back to law of specificity, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you want to improve in the long term, you want to be specific, right? And I think this question is in the immediacy right now. If I have to jump as high as possible, do I want to warm up with jumping, or do I want to warm up with frog pumps or whatever? I mean, I don't even know if you know what that exercise is, but I know that, I love Brett. I love Brett Contreras, but and that's a great exercise. But basically, you lay on your back, you put the soles of your feet together. So that means you have to have your knees bent and your legs apart. Okay. And so if the soles of your feet together, and then you sort of drive your feet downwards into the ground, and it's sort of like a glute bridge, but with your thighs very far apart. And you can feel your glutes contracting because they're very short in that position. And so it's really easy to feel them. But I don't know if that would outperform a jumping warm up as a warm up for jumping. It's not to say that it would be worse necessarily, because maybe what you're doing is just lowering the activation threshold with any activity, anything that gets blood flowing into that muscle, right? But the idea that there's this amnesia, this need for activation, why is it even an issue? Why do I even mention it or even think it's worth talking about? Because I think it's really easy to put ideas in people's minds about how weak and frail they are. In other words, Lawrence, I'm sorry, man. I hate to tell you this, but unless you do all of these special exercises every day, you're going to live your life in pain. Like that's not helpful to you because it establishes in your mind an idea that you're so easy to throw out of whack that you have to treat yourself like you're made of porcelain. You have to be do everything perfectly right to not live in pain. And that's why I take issue with this sort of stuff. It's not because I don't want people to exercise. I think it's great. If somebody likes doing glute bridges, awesome, do them and work your glutes and get stronger. But I raise a big eyebrow at anything that either claims to have the secret or that establishes in people's mind a dependency on some sort of secret knowledge just to keep themselves alive and functioning well.
Yeah, that was a great start. So I want to dig into this a bit more, and I feel quite pleased because you've kind of, my hypothesis really aligns with what you just said. I kind of felt like, watching a lot of these videos of muscle activation techniques, quote unquote muscle activation techniques. I kind of thought, what's the point? Why not just straight into the strength training? You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you've addressed quite a few points. I'm just looking at my list here to see what would be the ideal, I guess, next point to get into. And you've talked about tightness. Yeah, I mean, this muscle activation technique, and I know that might be trademarked. I don't know, and frankly, I don't care. I mean, I'm saying it, not you. And they seem to feel like muscle activation techniques which are kind of the things we were talking about there. You know, this kind of like, you know, what's the word? Palpation of muscle attachments, you know, pushing the muscle, doing these kind of random exercises that try to, you know, will activate a region, that they'll reduce muscular pain, dysfunction, tightness, weakness, or poor range of motion. But effectively what you're saying is that, look, a lot of these, you know, some of these exercises are fine, you know, like, you know, as you know, I've been rehabbing my shoulder, and you were a fan of me using isometric exercises for that, and isometrics and things of that nature might fall under the muscle activation technique category, perhaps. So I guess the question I have on this is, what are the types of things you might see in that world that you just think are redundant in terms of, I don't know, what type of techniques or exercises come under, you know, the muscle activation technique category?
Well, yeah. So let's define. First, I'll just throw one thought into our previous thought, or
Sure,
that we were talking about before. You know, when you're just going to leg press, I don't think you need to do a whole lot of special stuff to get ready for that. But if you're going to do something very technically complex, and particularly something where holding your body in a proper orientation really requires a lot of stability and skill just to be able to do the exercise quickly. And the best example of this is a barbell squat, right? Where you need to be flexible enough just to sit into the position to be at you know, mechanically advantageous. There probably is some benefit to getting a little more complicated, not necessarily from, you know, to put too complex a label on it. You know, we're doing this special, you know, we're activating tissues that weren't activated. I mean, honestly, I find that doing a leg press right before a barbell squat makes me feel like I can sit into a barbell squat way better. So we don't need to make it more complicated than that. Doing exercises that make you feel like you can sit comfortably into the bottom of that squat, that's probably beneficial. I don't know how complicated we need to get and putting names on those things. Are we activating, lengthening, what have you, right? But I mean, so some people are going to listen to this and think, well, wait a minute, I need to do those things for my complicated lifts. And you absolutely do, because that's a sporting event. A barbell squat, when you're going for high load attempts, that's kind of like a sporting event, right? And so there probably is some benefit to doing whatever you need to do to feel like you can comfortably be in the position. And I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. For most of our, you know, people like me and a lot of your listeners, it's not going to be as much of an issue, because we're going to be using lower skill exercises to kind of get at it. Now, as far as, you know, muscle activation technique as a proprietary term versus just exercises geared towards muscle activation, it's my understanding, and I want to disclose, I'm not an expert. I have no experience with muscle activation technique other than what I can read about it online. But it's
so modest.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a specific approach to trying to address what I can understand is pain, right? Trying to address a person's pain or postural problems by putting your hands on them and using your hands on the muscle to try to get that muscle to recruit in a different way. So, you know, look, there's no question that a person who's, for example, a person who's rehabbing from an ACL injury, right? And we talked about how they will have that inhibition in their quad, right? There's no question that like squeezing somebody's quad and the input that gives their body makes it a little easier for them to like recruit it again, right? You know, if you want to recruit your abs, or somebody's struggling to recruit their abs, poke them in the abs, right? Very quickly, that feedback is helpful for targeted, you know, recruitment of a muscle, right? So that's obviously a real thing. But I first want to say that my talk about activating muscles and whether or not it's really super important and how complicated we need to make it is about that general topic. I don't know if I'm missing something, and my own practice would be hugely improved by learning more about and adopting this muscle activation technique, the M.A.T, this proprietary thing. But I will say that I become very skeptical when people say that they can use their hands to quickly solve any problem at all. It makes me very skeptical because I've just seen so many areas in this sort of body work space, whether you're a massage therapist, a chiropractor, or a physical therapist, where you do something for somebody and you get this transient, meaning temporary effect that feels good. And they go, oh my gosh, I can raise my shoulder a little better. Oh my gosh, I can do this a little better. Oh my gosh, I can do that. It's fleeting. And the question is, what did you actually do, right? Did you actually increase the range of motion of this joint by elongating or breaking up scar tissue? Did you actually reposition a vertebrae that allows them to now move more economically? Or did you actually improve some relationship between motor neurons that's getting this muscle to fiber? Is that what you did? Or did you just put your hands on somebody in a confident and reassuring way that made them trust you and is a very powerful placebo effect, right?
Yeah.
So that's the problem, right? Is that so many of these techniques are not amenable to the scientific method. That doesn't mean they don't work or that they're wrong. It means it's very hard to test scientifically if they work or if they're wrong, because it's very, like, for example, a chiropractor would use the term adjustment. I will use, as a physical therapist, would use the term manipulation. But there are situations where I would do a manipulation in somebody's mid-back and it gives a crack, right? Like their knuckles are cracking essentially, right? There are situations where I might do that. And so the question is, how would you design a study that is double blinded for that, to determine whether what I'm doing is working? Well, you can't, because I know whether I'm really doing it or not. There's no way for me to ever do it in a way where I don't know if I'm doing it or not. For me to administer a placebo manipulation versus an actual manipulation is impossible, right? And then it's impossible for the patient or the client because they can feel whether they got that cavitation, that crack or not. So it's impossible from both parts. And it's doubly impossible for me because we know there's a great YouTube video by a guy named Lorimer Mosley talking about how complex the placebo effect is. And he talks about how if the study, if the person giving an injection in a study knows that what they're administering is the placebo, the affective changes that they display in their face, even if they're trying to hide it, will decrease how effective the placebo effect is. So think about that. I know I'm giving you blank anesthetic for your jaw. I know it's fake. And my knowledge of that is going to weaken how well the placebo effect works on you. You will get less pain relief than if I was blinded and didn't know whether I was giving you the real stuff or the fake stuff. So if I know it doesn't work, then the likelihood that I'm going to get a beneficial placebo effect goes down for you, even if you don't know. And so that makes things like this so hard because there's no way to design a blinded study, right? And blinding isn't always necessary. And it's not to say that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. I think you've probably heard me say that before. And that's a nuance. Just because we have yet to design a study that can show whether this works doesn't mean it doesn't work. We don't know whether it works. But what we do know is that nobody could confidently say the evidence points to this clearly being better than placebo because you can't design a study that shows it's better than placebo. So that's why it's tough. It's tough with any of these techniques, any hands-on techniques. If a person says, hey, I'm going to do this and it's going to make you feel good right now, which is going to help us move better during exercise, I am all about that. And so if somebody wants to, if a professional who is credentialed to do it wants to do a particular stretch or a particular manipulation or whatever that makes you, and all they tell you is, hey, this is going to make you feel a little better right now so that we can move better and work out harder. That's awesome. But if somebody says that they have the secret sauce again, that all they need to do is fix you in this way and you're going to feel better, I'm very skeptical. And the burden of proof is on them to validate that and to demonstrate the plausibility of their mechanism. So that's sort of my safe way of looking at any proprietary technique and saying, okay, you better bring a lot of evidence to bear to support why your proprietary technique is better than all the others, right? Because that's the tough thing, right? There are all of these ideas. Many of them are mutually exclusive. Which one's right? How do you pick as a consumer, as a physical therapist who's trying to increase your knowledge, or as a personal trainer who's trying to decide, hey, how do I want to specialize? Do I want to learn this technique? You need to be able to ask, okay, well, it looks sexy. People seem to get really flashy results in the immediacy right now, but is it actually, is there ever going to be a body of evidence that could prove that it works? And if so, if not, how confident can we be that what we're doing isn't just placebo? Again, because you can get a lot of great results with somebody by just, again, being confident, reassuring, telling them it's going to be okay, we're going to help you, putting your hands on them, doing something that seems flashy, using big words, making them feel like they're getting access to some really advanced technique. All of those things in a person's mind think, oh, finally, I'm getting what I need. I've been struggling. I've been alone. I don't know how to deal with this. Now I've got an expert who's going to help me. Right? It's all so attractive, and it really helps. It can help. It's not to say that it doesn't help people. The question is, when does it cross over into establishing an idea in a person that they are dependent on you for this special technique over and over again? And when does it cross over into convincing them that they're very fragile? And then I think you're getting into an area where it's actually not helping in the long term. It's actually hampering that person's long-term independence and their ability to live pain-free long-term, because they now feel dependent on you. So that's why I take issue with some of these techniques.
And also the third problem I see, I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I'm very sorry. I don't know what that was.
What was that?
I just have another monitor that was hooked up to something. And
it's all right.
Sorry,
we can
technical
don't
details.
Worry. Don't worry. We can edit that. Let me just make a note, and I'll just repeat what I said there. Third thing I see, and curious of your thoughts on this, is isn't there a problem though if there's so many of these proprietary techniques, which you've made us aware that we need to make sure anywhere that kind of says they have some sort of special knowledge or special kind of label to their technique, you should be skeptical and have a healthy skepticism for that, including high intensity training. Although I think once people understand the basic nature of high intensity training, they realize that it's not complicated and it's quite easy to understand, and then people know why it works and why it's ideal. But do you think there's a problem, going back to my point, with there being so many proprietary techniques that it really starts to muddy the waters, and it becomes what is already, fitness is already complex, but it makes it even more unnecessarily complex for people to find out what they should be doing to, rehab injuries, get healthier, reach their fitness goals, like when it could be consolidated right down into things that, we know work well, and kind of remove some of this redundant stuff. I have a concern about
that. So absolutely. It's really tough, right? Because what's the alternative to all these options? The alternative is one central committee makes a decision and tells everybody what to do. That's the alternative, right? And what if they get it wrong? Then the cost is much greater if they happen to just say, well, no, this is what the evidence says, and they whiff. And we know that organizations like that can just whiff wildly when they take a swing at the right answer, because we can look at dietary guidelines and things like that have come out that have been really off the mark. And we realize 30 years later, they're really off the mark. So yeah, I too would love to live in the world with the philosopher king who has all the perfect knowledge and is able to give it to us, because life would be better. But in the absence of that, we're sort of struck or stuck with a need to sort of have a marketplace of ideas where we have to hope that over time, the right information prevails. And I think it's only getting better. I mean, I think, there are a million options today, but if you look at the claims that are being made today, even though they're close to but missing scientific truth, they're certainly better than claims that are being made 100 years ago, which were wildly off, right? I'll push on your body in this way and cure your deafness, things like that, which are just so far away from, what I think is accurate. So I think I like to think that we're constantly course correcting as a whole space somebody's probably right and a bunch of people are wrong, but on the average, we're starting to average towards things that are a little more correct. So I'm optimistic, I guess I would say. But yeah, I'm with you. It is hard to sort of navigate this whole what do I want to say, ecosystem of treatment
I was about
options.
to use that word.
Great minds think alike, and so do we. But yeah, there's so many options. But what I think, one thing I can't count out is that there are people who are being helped by probably all of these options, right? So it's not necessarily that I want people to stop doing any of these techniques. It's more that I want the message of being careful with your language and careful with the ideas you instill in people. That is growing. And I think that can grow across paradigms, right? Like you have physical therapists who for the longest time have told people, hey, your sacroiliac joint is out. I need to help you put it back and fix it, right? And that's, now we know, I don't know, right? And then you have chiropractors who say, this is subluxed. I need to fix it. And now but the beautiful thing is we have chiropractors who are saying maybe we need to think about this in a more evidence-based way. We have physical therapists. So there's a lot of course correction coming from within. And I mean, several of the people who I trust most in this space are physical therapists, chiropractors, people who are sort of the course corrections coming from within all of these disciplines. And the message is very common, right? The message from all of these groups is, hey, look, and even from sports medicine physicians, the best of all of them are saying the same thing, which is, let's be a little more evidence-based, use the techniques that you want, but be careful about your words. That's the only thing where I really think you go wrong with some of these techniques, right? And some of these approaches is, like I said, in instilling ideas of, it's like the nocebo effect. If there's a placebo effect, which says if I do the right things, I'm going to get a benefit from you, even if there's no actual cure. The nocebo effect is if I tell you the wrong thing, I'm going to make you live in fear so much that you feel more pain, that you move less, that you deteriorate more, right? And that's real, right? That's very real. So avoiding that, if somebody wants to do their muscle activation technique and the person who they're working with feels better in the moment, that's awesome. Whatever, great. I don't want to take that on, or I try to be too harsh on any one technique, especially because I've believed many of these things. I've personally believed that, the upper cross, lower cross, yanda thing, and who knows, maybe one day I'll believe it again if evidence manifests for it, right? But right now I'm a cynic to a fault, right? Which means my options are limited, right, of what I can do with a patient, because it's like I can't bring myself to do something that knowingly relying on the placebo effect, which is tough, other than to just be confident and reassuring. So it's sort of the placebo persona. But, that's, I don't know, that's a little bit of a ramble there, but suffice to say that, yeah.
Yeah, I just careful not to move your mic around too much because it creates a bit of background noise. But no, one of the things I always remember you said once was, I don't understand when people face new ideas that conflict with their existing beliefs or paradigm, and they're shut off to it, or they're aggressive in response. You're like, and you were talking about your own personal experience. You're like, when someone comes to me and proves me wrong or gives me an alternative view on something that I think could be plausible, I get really excited.
Yeah,
I think that's such a healthy mindset.
I don't know if I'm always quite so enlightened, but yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That is, of course, what we should all strive for, right? We should all be striving for this idea that, when somebody confronts you with conflicting evidence, you really need to use theories that fit facts, not the other way around, and not to select your facts to fit your theories. But I mean, having said that, the more financially invested you become in something, right? The more you teach your kids that there is such a thing as truth, right? And that even is a real thing. Maybe there is no such thing as truth, and that's just a figment, and this is all a construct, and it's just whatever, right? I mean, you could, but if you're going to teach your kids that, and you're going to spend 10 years teaching your kids that, it's going to be very hard for you to change your mind about it. Whereas if you had no commitment, either financial or emotional, it's easier to change your mind. So it's easy for me, having yet to commit to any one of these ideas, to be very objective. It's much harder, and I have a lot of sympathy for anybody who has, for example, after physical therapy school, spent 3 years in an added curriculum learning one of these methods, and a lot of investment in money, right? And then now they've committed. Now they're invested in it. and then to come back and be like, oh, it's all bogus. That's really hard. And I think I don't count myself in the company of people who are so objective that they can easily do that, because I don't know if I could easily do it if I was that invested in any one thing. And it's probably maybe that's true for high intensity training, right? Maybe I have a business that sells high intensity training. Maybe I'm overly committed to it. Who knows, right? The way I ease my conscience about it is, and you kind of touched on this before, is, and this is sort of just a general high intensity idea or training is, somebody says, well, what if you don't have the secret? And I say, no, you're right. Nobody has the secret. So let's make this take as little time as possible and be as uncomplicated as possible. And I think it's sort of coming at all of this from a position of humility, right? And saying, hey, nobody's got the answer as to what the super exercise is. So let's just work out hard and not get hurt, because none of it probably matters other than that, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, so I'm not selling a secret. I'm just saying, let's not get hurt. Let's not waste time. And that's sort of how I try to flip it around, so that I'm trying to make sure that I'm not lying to myself and try to think of it in that way, as opposed to thinking, it's motor unit recruitment, it's sequential unit recruitment, Henneman size principle. I've cracked the code. It's momentary muscular failure. If I think about it in that way, it's easier to fool myself. If I think about it from a let's not waste time, let's not get hurt perspective, I feel a little better about what I'm selling, because I feel I can have absolute integrity about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I noticed that you started dipping a toe in postmodernism, relative truth, and all that. Which let's not go there. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But and
I'm not even questioning any of those ideas, but just saying that any idea that you happen to invest in for a while, it's going to be hard to walk away from the more you invest into it. Right?
I agree, and I can completely relate to that. I mean, I have a podcast called High Intensity Business, right?
Right.
And so I used to say, it's funny, I've even said this on previous podcasts before. I've said, I'm not biased about high intensity training. I clearly am. How could I not be? And I think I fought myself a little bit there. So I'm personally trying to keep more of an open mind around this. And, slightly off topic, and we'll certainly jump back to the main topic in a second. But, recently had a friend of mine who you probably know, Scott Mysinski, who's been on the show before, and he's the host of the Carnivore Cast. He's been doing, having been a HIIT devotee for, probably the same amount of time I have, just under 10 years, something like that. He switched over to trying a higher volume, higher frequency approach, inspired by Borg Fagale, if I'm saying his name correctly, and, training just shy of failure. And, this is obviously, it's hard to control the variables, and there's many, many things in play, and this could be conflated. It might not just be the training. I mean, he's a pure carnivore, and he's an incredibly disciplined guy when it comes to his diet. But he's put on 20 pounds of muscle.
That's awesome.
Right? 20 pounds. At least that's what he's told me, and I do believe Scott. And I'm going to be talking to him about this in more detail. In something like 2 years of changing this protocol around. Now, he's probably, I don't know what else has changed, and we're going to have to dig into that. But that really piqued my curiosity, and my initial reaction was actually a negative one. I was like, "Oh, shut up, Scott!" Like in my head, not and say that to him. I was like, and he'll listen to this and probably find this quite funny. But I sort of read that and thought, like, oh, well, that can be explained away. HIIT's still superior to other protocols, but that's not productive, right? And I'm skeptical, but I'm really trying to keep an open mind. And maybe, just maybe, there is an approach to training that is, because I've always kind of believed, certainly in the last few years, that HIIT done in the way we do it and talk about it is probably optimal from a hypertrophy point of view. But I'm now wondering whether or not his approach may be more productive for that end.
And I think it's so important that you think about which claims you're going to hang your hat on when you sell HIIT, right? If you're selling the idea that it's going to give bigger and better results, then it's on you to back that up, right? You have now accepted the burden of proof to prove that claim. And that's tough. And it may be wrong for some people and right for other people, right? Whereas if you're saying, if the claims are, this is going to take a very little amount of time, you're not going to get hurt doing it, we're going to be able to deeply recruit and fatigue muscles that otherwise you might not be able to do safely. And we're probably going to be able to prevent a lot of age-related muscle loss. Just in 20 minutes, we're going to do all of that stuff. If you pick those claims, it's very easy to defend those claims because the standard of the threshold that you need to meet to hit those is low. So we already know it's slow. Time efficient, right? Because you're just taking 20 minutes. So anyway, I think it really matters what claims that you're going to hang your hat on, because it's the person who claims superiority that has to prove it, right? And I don't claim that this is superior to other forms of exercise from a hypertrophy standpoint. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that this is the minimum that a person has to do. And then if some people will tolerate a lot more and respond well to a lot more, and some people won't, and it's up to the individual to decide that. I think, a lot of the research on longevity suggests that, having adequate muscle mass is really important, just like having adequate red blood cells is really important. But that tripling your number of red blood cells might not confer any advantage at all. But having red blood cells that work really well does. So having quality muscle, having the muscle that you do have be very strong and maximizing the strength of your existing muscle and not losing muscle. That's what's important from a longevity standpoint. And then on top of that, adding muscle mass, there may be a lot of things that do that. I certainly, flirt with those things and like to experiment on myself. With my clients, if a person does come twice a week instead of once a week, I like to get creative with what I do for them and try to be a little individualistic, mostly from a optimizing the experience in the moment perspective rather than from optimizing sort of this long-term, very hard to detect change. But yeah, so nothing about your friend's story makes me doubt myself at all, because I'm not trying to sell 20 pounds of muscle. I'm trying to sell this safety and efficiency and preventing atrophy, building strength, and maybe for certain individuals, building actual appreciable muscle size, right? The other thing is that a person can sustain no acute injuries and suffer overuse injuries, right? And so then it's always, I don't think even your friend would deny that there's a risk that as you increase volume, there's a chance that that's going to start to nag at you.
He's even said that he might revert back to maintain in the future if that is possible. Because he agrees with you. I would argue, I'm speaking for him now, but with everything you just said in terms of the benefits, I certainly do, obviously.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's awesome that he does that. I think anybody who has the wherewithal to do it safely and to increase their volume and be really super methodical about, hey, I'm going to sleep my 9 hours, I'm going to eat my perfect nutrition, I'm going to do all that stuff, and that's awesome, right?
Well, he doesn't have 4 children, though, Bryce, so he's at an advantage, and he's young.
Right, yeah. How old is he?
I think he's late 20s. Yeah. 28, 29, something like that. Yeah.
Did he lift? This is a big dovetail, so we can move on.
Yeah, for sure. But just one final point on this before we do move on is, it's funny because I'm opening my mind to an alternative approach which may yield greater hypertrophy than high intensity training, does not mean that I would then suddenly abandon my entire mission for all the reasons you just described, because I love high intensity training. I love the fact that I love anything that's so elegant and beautiful and efficient as HIIT, which seems to be that for exercise. And obviously, I'm having discovered that I'm now so passionate about trying to help others, grow their businesses in this. And that's the path that that the blog and the podcast has now taken on,
Yeah. Just because you're selling the benefits of sauna treatment doesn't mean that you can't also discover that cold immersion therapy is beneficial too. Who knows, right? Nothing about that changes the fact that this is also very beneficial to a specific population of time-pressed, injury-averse people, right? So
I think I almost had the, back in the day when this was called Corporate Warrior, and the prevailing theme of the conversation was how do we grow as much muscle mass as possible? It almost got to a point where I was trying to prove that HIIT was right, which is obviously incredibly unscientific. But anyway, that was very interesting tangent. But keen to jump back to the main thing. To be honest, in terms of muscle activation, I've got a whole list of stuff here which you kind of addressed very, very well. So I want to kind of move on from that. Unless you've got anything more to say specifically on muscle activation techniques or things like that before we move on. Is there anything
No, I mean, if people have questions about it and want my thoughts, I'm happy to kind of talk about it again later or in comments on the thread. I hate to think that I'm doing the topic a disservice. So only thing I want to do is offer a framework for how to evaluate claims rather than say that conclusively I know whether things do or don't work, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah. So you did touch on this a little bit, but there's a, we know that in strength and conditioning, there's an enormous amount of coaching folklore, stuff that's been passed down through the generations, which has almost cemented these practices, especially in professional sports where athletes are doing things that are just absolutely crazy. Strength and conditioning activities that put themselves at risk, don't really add a much value and, are just, likely to be a contributor to the number of injuries we see in professional sports. And I'm just curious, in terms of stuff like muscle activation techniques, and these kind of proprietary techniques, why are they so prevalent? Is it just simply a matter of a free market? People want to build a business, make money, so they come up with these things and they trademark them and build a business around them and then, license them out or whatever? Or is there something else going on here? Is there some sort of coaching folklore, things being passed down through the ages, these kind of axiomatic things that we don't question? How do you think about all that?
Well, I think that it really boils down to this element of human nature where people are pattern recognizers. We love and we're good at recognizing certain kinds of patterns, but we become bad at using that element of our minds when a system becomes at a certain level of complexity, right? So a lot of your impulses about how to deal with a community of 140 people on an island are going to be right. And then you try to take those same impulses and apply them to an economy of 300 million, and they're not wrong because they're not helpful. Or you're trying to, look at something very simple. I'm struggling to find an example. Maybe farming would be a simple example of, hey, I irrigate and I crop rotate in these few variables and I get good results. And so those patterns, we learn from that. And now I'm going to try to apply that to something infinitely complex like the human body. And it's not going to work because it's not going to be amenable to this very simplistic way of doing things. But that doesn't change the fact that my human nature is to try to identify patterns. If I think I've identified a pattern, I feel very clever. I want to share it. If I can make a living off of it, I'll do it. Right. I mean, it's just human nature. I think I don't think anybody, myself included, can be absolutely objective all the time about all things. That's not real. And so I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is that we don't try variables in isolation. So I'm a coach of a high school football team, and I always have my athletes, eat steak and eggs for breakfast, deadlift and squat and bench press, and read Shakespeare at night. And they're a really good football team. And I think that all three of those things are essential because that's always how we've done it, right? And how do we know, right? You haven't been empirical about it. And I think it's really easy for things to kind of become part of the psyche because it's just how we've always done it. We did it for a while and it worked. We don't actually know if what we did is why it worked, but we know that there's a sort of A happened, then B happened, therefore A caused B fallacy there. And that's sort of how I look at, and that's how I try to explain to myself when I see things. And I'm like, how on earth did anybody come to think that this was a good idea, that we need to be sitting on a Swiss ball doing my dumbbell presses overhead, and that's going to make me a better basketball player or whatever. I think it's got to be because of that, because of this. We thought we recognized a pattern. It worked, and therefore we concluded, aha. And that's why the scientific method exists, right? Because humans are not by nature scientific, and we need this sort of actual rigorous testing of hypotheses to make conclusions.
Yeah, no, well said. So I want to bring this back to high intensity training, and then kind of dive into some questions that were submitted around the kind of the line drawn between the physio and the trainer and things like that. I thought this was quite funny. David Landau, always a funny guy on social media, posted on Facebook in response to, that we were doing this and I was looking for questions. it's something like, I said in the comment, is a muscle activation necessary? And he said, if that was the case, my ass would be a pancake, but it isn't. And which is kind of, in line with what we've been saying this entire time. So I think that's no surprise. But do you think like this is why this particular type of protocol doesn't come up much in HIIT, because a lot of the individuals within high intensity training have kind of figured out that it's not really necessary if you're doing, safe strength training?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's so easy to confuse some sort of obscure neurological mechanism for somebody just being weak because they're sort of atrophied, right? And again, let's go back to the ACL example. It's really easy to look at somebody who's 6 months after an ACL injury and to say, well, quads are still weak. I guess they're still not firing right. We got to keep figuring that out. But then when you actually look at the cross-sectional area, you see, no, they're just really atrophied. It's just a muscle mass issue. It's a cross-sectional area issue. But it's, that's easy to hide. It's really very easy for somebody to lose 10 or 20% of their cross-sectional area, but not from your naked eye an appreciable size change because there's a little bit of body fat around the knee, what have you. Somebody has to be pretty lean to see a sizable, for you to be able to tease that out and just with your naked eye. And so you have a case where you have atrophy. You confuse that with muscles being asleep. And so that's David's point, right? He sits probably quite a bit of the time, like most of us do, when he's not exercising. And yet I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume he has fantastic glutes, right? Like the rest of us, right? Because he trains them. And I think he's absolutely right. It's if you keep the muscle quality high because you train your muscles, I don't think they're going to go to sleep on you because you sit down for 6 or 8 hours a day. I don't think that's real. Because I don't think that muscles go to sleep apart from some sort of actual impairment, like swelling inside of a joint, a neurological lesion of some kind. I think those are the things that are actually necessary. I think our bodies are just much more robust than we give ourselves credit for. I mean, people get hit by cars and are reconstructed and somehow manage to get back. And if they can survive those things like that, how is it possible that I can't survive sitting down for 6 hours? I mean, it doesn't add up, right? So we got to give ourselves a little more credit. Our bodies are amazing. We just need to challenge them, not perseverate over elegant theories that may end up kind of making us think we're very porcelain and fragile,
And do you think, flipping the script a little bit, most high intensity training studios will, practice pretty much just strength training, right? So they put someone through a workout, 5 to 10 exercises, single set to failure, maybe some advanced techniques thrown in. Thank you very much. See you next week. Do you think that any of the practitioners, the business owners that listen to this are missing anything? I'm just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is there some aspects of M.A.T, muscle activation techniques, or other things that come to mind where they do add value to a HIIT practice?
Yeah.
Not your practice, because you do physiotherapy, right? So that's different.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, if we define our terms, I think that muscle activation technique really is a hands-on technique. But in terms of just muscle activation exercises in general, I don't know if a person is seeing strength improvements, a client is seeing strength improvements broadly, if they're missing anything from that perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to benefit from, taking up trail running or being physically active. I think physical activity is generally better than being sedentary, if it's not particularly damaging, right? That's the trick, right? But I think where it can be complex is if a person has been struggling with pain for a while, right? And then the question is, do they need more, right? Do they need either training on how to regard their pain? I think it gets much more complicated, right? And so, is that what you mean? Are you talking about with people who are just generally healthy and looking to preserve their strength and feel strong, or are you talking about more?
Yeah, to keep it simple, I suppose, obviously if someone comes in and they've got, obvious abnormalities or things that come out in the wash when you're training, then, we talked before in previous podcasts about, when you would defer to someone like you, a specialist. But I suppose we could talk about just a healthy individual.
Yeah. And I mean, so that healthy individual is going to benefit from all sorts of things, right? They're going to benefit from sauna treatments, sun exposure, proper sleep. At a certain point, the HIIT business owner has to decide, hey, what am I going to major in, right? And that's high intensity strength training. And then what do you need to add to that? Well, you have a finite amount of time because that's part of the value proposition. So if I have functionally, let's say average session 30 minutes, really I've got 25 because of small talk and this and that and getting ready for the next client. How am I going to spend those 25 minutes? It's hard for me to say that any of those 25 minutes would be better served with a drill designed to wake a muscle up versus just an exercise that's maximal for that muscle. Maybe that's the short and sweet answer.
I love that answer. The business model is far more attractive.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, you have a choice between, well, do I want to make this more complicated or do I want to get a whole extra exercise in? Maybe I can get neck isolation exercise in, an adductor exercise. I think that there is value in being pretty thorough top to bottom, especially if you have the time to do that, especially if you've got more than one workout in a week with a person and you can have a split routine and kind of address muscles that are harder to address just with a standard big 4 or big 5, or maybe you're addressing an area that this person has a lot of concerns about. Maybe they know they really need to keep their neck strong because otherwise they have neck issues. And so you've got to take the time. You got to think about how you're going to use your time, and you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, but you need to use your time for what you're really selling and not try to get distracted. And I think there's so many distractions, but I think that the main value proposition that we have is enough to be really useful to a client.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, obviously you've got a number of smart gyms coming up now, number of ARX gym or smart gym owners that are in the membership and that have been featured on the podcast. And they're using a variety of technologies, ARX, Carol bikes, saunas, Vaspa, cryotherapy, all this kind of stuff. I'm obviously skeptical about some of those technologies, but it would seem that there are a handful certainly that do have evidence to support them and may be valuable. And I was thinking there in the context of a HIIT business, it's thinking, these things get in the way of the efficiency of the business model, the half-hour sessions. But then it occurred to me, well, and this is a little bit off topic, but just got me thinking, is, you currently have, let's say, just a suite of strength training machines, kind of like your place at the moment, Bryce. You could have, let's say, you could implement a infrared sauna, and you could make that thing self-service, so it's not eating into your time, right? So if someone wants to have a shower, if you have showering facilities, and then wants to sit in the sauna, or maybe they just want to get the red light therapy type of thing, they could do that after your session, and you don't have to manage them. You can move on to your next client. It's totally self-service. So I'm just thinking out loud here in terms of the business models and how they might evolve. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about incorporating a sauna or having things like that all the time. I don't mean by my comments to in any way suggest that we shouldn't diversify our offerings to clients at all. I think that's great, especially because you find that you become sort of this trusted agent for that client. Right. And they start to really value your opinion on a diverse area of things. John Little's podcast, he talked about how you have to be careful not to become a guru. I think that's absolutely right. And you want to be very evidence-based. But at the same time, there are certain things we know are valuable. Sun exposure is valuable. Saunas are valuable. Sleep is valuable. If you can find a way to augment your client's life in any other way, whether it's encouraging them to download the Zero app. I have a lot of my clients download that just so we can kind of get them doing some. It's an app that just makes it really low mental energy to do fasting time, which sounds like how low is it? It's really easy to fast.
You post that, don't you, on our Facebook thing? Showing off your fasting.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good for an accountability perspective, right? It makes people say, ooh, do I really want to see my average fast duration start to slip because I'm going to wait 30 minutes and then have another scoop of ice cream? Or do I want to just shut it down at 7? And that accountability helps some of my clients. They really value it. So, and it's free. So I have no stake in it, but it's just a cool app. So, I do think we should look at in every way that we can add value that doesn't take away from our main value proposition. That's the only thing I mean. And so if a person's workout, because they have an ARX and they can be hyper efficient, it only takes 12 minutes or whatever, hey, that's great. And if the client's willing to come for a whole 30 minutes, maybe the right answer is that they jump on the Vesper and then they go in the sauna. That's great.
So a few final questions for you, Bryce, and then we'll wrap up. And I just want to take a moment to say, if you're having challenges in your high intensity training business with regard to clients asking questions about any kind of orthopedic issues, and in particular knee pain, and concerns about, will high intensity training exacerbate my knee pain and things like that. Me and Bryce, quite a while ago, we did a piece in a membership on how to answer questions and customize workouts for clients with orthopedic issues. So we did that from a HIIT perspective, and that was so good and so productive. And so if you're interested in getting access to content like that and tons of resources on how to grow your high intensity training business, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/membership. So next question I had for you was, and this is some of the things that were submitted. Now, we've talked about this before in terms of the line you need to draw between your skill set as a high intensity trainer and when you should defer someone to a physiotherapist. I mean, you have the luxury of having both skill sets and providing services in both domains. But, I'm just curious how you, I guess, think about this now. I mean, it's been a while since we've spoken about this topic. So I'll just come out with a question. How would someone recognize where an individual may be going beyond their level of expertise if they're, a high intensity trainer?
Yeah. So I mean, it's hard for me as a physical therapist because there's a temptation to just say, oh, well, your neck's hurting today. Let's just skip the workout and jump on the table, right? And we'll look at maybe something I could do with my hands to help you, right? There's a temptation there to do that. And I try not to. I really don't. I don't like to blur the two community or the two disciplines too much. I think I let my insights help people work hard because they know that, oh, well, my instincts say I shouldn't exercise because I don't want to get hurt. Oh, Bryce says it's okay. Here's his rationale. Okay, I'm convinced. I'll work hard. So I try to use my knowledge to help them. But I will routinely defer to a client, encourage them to see another physical therapist if I'm not super confident with their diagnosis. And I actually have a client right now who's going to physical therapy for something else. He had an issue spring up that he got relief from years ago with a physical therapist in his town, and he drives about 30 minutes to see me. And so he just went back to her, and I said, that's great. And then I don't get involved in that issue. I mean, I'll give him advice on how we exercise in here and how we can compensate around that issue while he's dealing with it. But I really try to say, hey, trust your physical therapist until you can't, right? Until something happens where you feel like you need to switch, that's your physical therapist. So more, generally for the average trainer, how do you know where your skill set ends and the physio's begins? We touched on this a little bit, I think, with our first podcast, but I think, you have to start asking that question of yourself as soon as there's joint pain, right? And then the question is, okay, is this joint pain the kind of issue that has been simmering for many years and that the person just lives with, but it's a nuisance? Or is it something that popped up last week, right? Acute versus chronic. If they just have some arthritis in their knee, their shoulder, they have to be conscious. They get some back pain sometimes. Then it's like, well, okay, let's work around it. Let's be cautious. Obviously, your trainers, I'm assuming, have had all of their clients sign the waiver, and that waiver says something to the effect that they are encouraged to be routinely evaluated by a physician and that they have a physician's clearance to exercise, right? So you got to cover yourself, but you also do want to genuinely encourage people, hey, if there's an issue that creeps up on you out of nowhere, you need to get it checked out. Go see a professional. That's outside of my wheelhouse. I think for me, I don't want to muddy the waters of my high intensity training business, especially because long term I want to have employees who aren't physical therapists probably. I don't want them to be feeling like they have to solve every one of this client's problems, even though it's tempting. As like I said in John Little's podcast, it's really easy to become the one source for health information. You have to be careful. So I think pain that is acute is a great example of something that you want to encourage that person to refer out. Now, if they went on a long walk yesterday and their plantar fasciitis acts up, that's different, right? But if there's a pop or a crack or a snap and there's this very acute injury that has signs of swelling, redness, all of those signs of active inflammation, they rest. If it doesn't get better with rest, they need to seek medical attention, right? I think when in doubt, you kind of need to defer to somebody else, right? To if you're just a trainer, and I don't want to belittle trainers, but if you don't have higher medical education and you're not comfortable treating an issue, then you shouldn't dabble in the issue. I realize it's so gray and blurry of an answer, but I would rather give an answer that encourages people to quickly seek a referral than an answer that opens the door for people to try to dabble in physical therapy when they're not one, if that makes sense. I think, so again, are we managing a long old issue here, or is this a new problem that needs evaluation? Is a good way of kind of thinking about pains and aches. If a person says, hey, I've been to physical therapy for my knees plenty of times, but they're just arthritic and they hurt. Okay, well, you know what? That's probably okay for you to just safely load them and get their muscles stronger, right? But if they twisted their ankle yesterday, it's different.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's it.
No, it's just kind of occurred to me that I bet Discover Strength have a workflow for this. You know what I mean? Ask this question, someone, if they say yes, then ask this one. And, that kind of workworkflow. You know what I mean?
I bet they do. And if they don't, then they will 6 minutes after they listen to this episode, right?
Yeah, because as is probably no surprise to you, certainly seeing as what's going on in the membership, is I've just become so passionate about systems and processes lately, which sounds very nerdy, but, learning more about that, reading the E-Myth Revisited, and implementing a lot of that in my own business has been so fun and so game changing. And, that's kind of the way I've been thinking a lot lately. So when I think about what you just said there, I'm like, you need to create a system where your trainer asks these questions, and based on these responses, this is the outcome, and it's just the same every time,
Maybe that's something we can collaborate on for the membership then, because that's probably something that would be valuable for me to create for my own business. Yeah.
I love
for my future employees.
I'd love to do that. And that would be massively valuable to everyone. That's an awesome idea. I just want to say, I appreciate everything you've done in terms of when you feature on the show. This is definitely one of my favorite podcasts ever. I'm not just saying that. It's just definitely been one of those. And
thanks.
The stuff we've done in the membership too is just awesome, which I, shamelessly had to plug. But that's all good. So is there anything, covered everything I had planned. Is there any parting thoughts you've got on this subject we've covered today? Things you want the listeners to take away that's important to you on this?
So closing thoughts, I guess, are that it's easy to overthink all this stuff. Develop a framework for how you evaluate claims that you read about and hear about. And then when you want to activate somebody's muscles, have them do exercise and they'll activate. And if they actually, notice that one side of their body, and that's another referral thing, right? An asymmetrical problem, something that's only on one side of the body. If you actually notice that they visually can't recruit a muscle on one side of their body, they need immediate, quick medical attention, right? That's how we look at it. These problems are not simmering problems that require elegant solutions. They are either refer to a physician or just exercise them. And I think we can be comfortable with that.
Awesome. No, I appreciate that. And I just remembered we didn't really talk much about the business, and I really want to ask you about that. We've got a few minutes here. So how's things going at Strength Space? I mean, from outside looking in, it looks like things are going great. Talk to me about, what's changed over the last since we last spoke, whenever that was 12 months ago, something like that.
Yeah, it's been a while. Business is growing slowly and steadily. I think a big part of that has been sort of my referral network and having relationships in networking groups, relationships with other physical therapists, physicians. I actually just did an episode on a Fitness Candor podcast. Got interviewed there, and we talked a lot about how important it is to network and to bring value to local physical therapists, local physicians over your common clients. And that was something that's something that's helpful for me, right? When I'm acting as a trainer and I reach out to somebody's physical therapist or a physician and say, hey, I want to make sure we're on the same page here. How can I help your patient to make sure I'm not doing anything you don't want. That builds those relationships. And so that's been helpful for me in growing my own referral network. Right now I'm really in the thick of trying to systematize the way you were just describing, and taking everything that is reflexive and in my head and get it out of my head, because of one of my big goals is that first employee. But I want to make sure that I have everything in place before we get there. I don't need the help of an employee yet, but I want to bring them in once everything is ready, so that I can start to make this place a little more anti-fragile, right? If I get hit by a bus, strength space is going to take a little break. And so I want to get to a point where we're not in that situation. So definitely enjoying things like the E-Myth and Traction and important books that kind of build those ideas. So it's still a fun project. Long way to go to be where I can just kick my heels up, but it's great.
You'll never do that.
You're probably right.
What are you? Well, firstly, I'll just mention, regarding systems, I don't know if you saw, but yesterday I uploaded the first draft of the Master Hit Business Checklist, which is I took a template that I had, which is a template for any business in terms of the important things you need to address, and I tried to mold it to a hit business, and then I linked to all of the specific trainings for each of the points. So that the goal is to have a solution for every stage, but then, as you pointed out, keep that forum open where people can discuss their opinions on it. They can iterate and refine. Like that's a really important aspect of it. When you get a chance, check that out.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah,
I'm looking for your feedback as well. You're one of my people I need feedback from. What was I going to say? I've totally forgotten about your. Oh, yeah, that's it. So, what are you still? Because whenever I find myself getting overwhelmed or busy, I just think of you, and because you just make me look bad. I mean, you have 4 kids, right?
I do. I have 4 great kids. Yeah.
You run Strength Space. You do the training. You do the physiotherapy stuff. I know you have a co-founder as well who does that too. And then you also still. He's still a lecturer in therapy as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm an adjunct at 2 programs in the area. One is a physical therapy program at Old Dominion University, and the other is a physical therapist assistant program, which is sort of a support staff for physical therapists. They're licensed professionals as well. And I'm just lucky enough to find an opportunity that fell into my lap, friend of a friend. It's who you know, and got to teach. And I'm teaching there now twice a week. So yeah, I enjoy that as a way to keep myself sharp. I think I'm attracted to being associated with a university because it forces you to constantly reevaluate, because you have young students who are always saying, well, wait a minute, how do we know that? And that's just so valuable for me. And then it's also a great way to keep my network growing. My network, the number of therapists in the area that I know has grown considerably just since I started teaching in January. So that's been helpful. And then I still do some home health treatment visits for a local home health agency where I treat patients in their homes. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff. I will say, 4 kids sounds tough, but I have a pretty amazing wife who's kind of makes all of that easy for me, I'll say. So does
she work, or does she
she stays
after
at
the
home.
kids? Yeah,
it
makes sense.
Home.
Yeah.
So it makes it it makes life for me. I get to show up at the end of the day and have smiling faces, right? Happy to see me, because she has managed to keep them all alive all day. So she gets the credit, and I'm enjoying the fruits, I think, in that regard. But
do you ever now stop me if I'm getting too personal, but do you ever struggle with, like, because you've got various income streams there. Now, do you have a business, you run it all through, or do you ever struggle with, like, trying to, make your personal income quite efficient? Because, I don't know what it's like in the US, but, in the UK and Ireland, if you've got a secondary revenue stream or whatever, you might have to pay 40% tax on that. So,
No, I think so. For us, it really boils down to, so I don't have any passive revenue streams. It can get different there. Like if you have a passive investment that's just sending you money, one day my equity in Strength Space might become totally passive. If I were to totally take my hands off the business and have other people running it, then that would be a passive revenue stream. But I don't have any passive revenue streams. Everything I do is essentially either the business or part-time work at other organizations. And so no, it doesn't get I have to itemize and report everything, but it doesn't get super complex. It doesn't get complicated by a changing of my tax bracket simply because there are multiple streams, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Cool. No, I just think to myself, I think about what you do and all your kids. I think, man, that guy must be under some financial pressure sometimes, But,
I mean, we're lucky now because the kids are all small. But I have 3 daughters, right? So if depending on how traditional we want to be with weddings and things like that, it's definitely, it's motivating for me for sure. Right. Because
are you just hoping that university will be obsolete by the time they are old enough to go? So you won't have to fork out 6 figures each.
Both I and my wife had to find our own way to pay for school, I don't know if I'm ever in the position where I'm doing so well that we can afford to front some of the cost of their education. I would want to be able to help them. That'd be great. But I do think that education, and hey, here's another podcast for your other podcast show, is just the way education is changing, with things like the Khan Academy and open resources. I have no idea what higher education is going to look like in 10 or 20 years, but I can't imagine it's going to look exactly the same as it looks right now, because I don't know if the way costs have grown relative to the economy is in any way sustainable. So something is going to change. I don't know what it is.
I agree.
But I don't know if I can hedge against it other than to keep my kids inquisitive and anti-fragile personally, right? So that's the only thing I can do for them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, you can do. I believe you can do MIT and Harvard courses on YouTube now. So
absolutely, it's amazing.
It's evolving. I want to be respectful of your time, Bryce. I know we're at the 1:15 mark. Best way for people to find out more about you?
Yeah, so my website is strength-space.com, strength-space.com. I started blogging there, and I put out my first article. And then I like to communicate with people on Twitter, especially a lot of the things we've talked about, a lot of the thinkers in the rehab space I interact with on Twitter at Bryce Lee. E is in the letter echo, E, Bryce Lee. So I love to chat with people if anybody has any ideas. And then I'm on Instagram a little bit, put up a little content here and there on Instagram. Either way, you can probably reach me through an email address from the website if you want to go there, or hit me up on Twitter. Love to talk.
Awesome. And I'll link to all that in the show notes. And to find the show notes for this episode, please go to highintensitybusiness.com// muscle-activation. And for all episodes, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Discover how to achieve your health and fitness goals, become a great personal trainer, and build a successful high-intensity training business. Check out highintensitybusiness.com. highintensitybusiness.com.